Welcome to The Witch in the Woods, and today I want to talk about what is the Norse pagan Yule. So we all know that the season of Christmas owes far more to Northern European traditions than it ever does to Christian doctrine. And it's hard to decipher what is a true tradition and what was reinvented sometime in the last century and packaged commercially to be sold to us as a corporate money fest, to be honest. So the question I'd like to know is, what can we decipher about what is a real Yule tradition and what can we gain from one? So it was often condemned by the church, but Yule is a season that has been persistent for hundreds if not thousands of years. People have tried to condemn its festivities for centuries, and yet somehow it always creeps back into our consciousness and into our lives. Now, the thing about Yule is that it is a Northern European tradition, and it has spread across the world in its form. So it seems that there are a few erroneous aspects of Yule. One is that it was celebrated on the 25th of December, and one is that it really has anything to do with Christ's birth, neither of which take place in the middle of winter. Now, it seems that Yule was hijacked by Mithraism and later by, the Christian Church, who added aspects of Mithraism, which was a very popular religion at the time of early Christianity. And Mithras was said to be born on the 25th of December, but it would have no mention in the Bible or anywhere else of Christ being born on this date. And nor was Yule celebrated on this date. It would seem that Yule was perhaps celebrated on the full moon following the winter solstice. So it was a Northern European tradition, but it would seem that the sun wasn't very evident immediately after the winter solstice in the far north of Scandinavia and Norway. And so the celebration and the feasting may actually have taken place when the sun began to gain a little bit of strength, which was apparently the full moon after the new moon following the winter solstice. So what we have is a mishmash of traditions and a mishmash of theology that somehow has been sold and packaged to us as a seasonal festivity, and yet has too many odd loose ends to sit comfortably with quite a few people. So I'd like to talk about the Norse traditions, and particularly the tradition of the Yule log and the kindling of the winter sun, and how we can utilise this in a pagan practice today. However, the traditions that were passed down to us actually owe a lot to the Christian Church. Without them, we would not have quite a strong tradition surviving until these times, possibly. So, ironically, although the Christian Church tried to condemn all things pagan, it had to actually adopt and incorporate many pagan practices in order to sell it back to the pagans as a new faith called Christianity, in a form that they would understand and in a form that would be not too alien to them as a Roman Mediterranean religion might actually have been. So we owe this to the church that we have these traditions still continuing to this day. And ultimately it meant the absorption of paganism into a Christian tradition. But the traditions have become widespread across the world, and what these actually show us is what we can understand of Norse paganism and European heathenism. And so Yule is continued even to this day, even though its form has been altered considerably. But we've always wanted to celebrate this festival, and we've always found that the midwinter was a significant time for feasting and a party. So Yule is the midwinter blot, or the midwinter sacrifice to the gods, and what this involved was the sacrifice of particularly horses and pigs or boars to the gods as a way of asking for continued fertility, luck and beneficence in the following year. It was a sign of respect to the gods that at this season they were gifted and we received gifts from them too. So in this way there's a certain kind of karmic payback, which is we can see in a lot of the tradition in people who have been good and hardworking receiving benefits and payback at this time. And the spirit is one of peace, generosity, laying down arms and reuniting in a sense of oneness. Now the feasts seem to have some elements of drinking lots of ale, remembering long lost dead ones, remembrance of the ancestors, and particularly remembrance of what we might call the Holy Mothers. Now Bede tells us that in the Anglo-Saxon times, on the day before Christmas Eve, or the day of Christmas Eve, they held a celebration called Modronite, or Modronite, and this was a feast for the sacred mothers. Now it doesn't seem too far-fetched to believe that this also may relate to the Blot, which was a Norse pagan festival of remembrance of the ancestral guardians, the motherline and the great guardians of the tribe in the form of female deities. Now we don't know when this took place, but there is some reference to it taking place between as the year turned towards midwinter, which some people believe was around autumn or Halloween, or as the winter turned at the solstice, which could possibly mean Yule. And this was a very sacred time. So I'll come back to this sacred mother in a minute, but first let us go on to Odin. Now Odin was called the Yule Father. He was the father of Yule, which is how we understand his relation to our figure of Santa Claus and Father Christmas. But he is the great beneficial male force of generosity, giving, kindness and strength. Now in Eastern Europe and Russia and the Slavic countries, there is another figure called Dod Moroz, and he is like the Russian Father Christmas. And his role is also gift giving and travelling around between houses to deliver good cheer, goodwill and beneficial influence. Now his name actually means grandfather time or old man time. He is also known as Grandfather Frost, and he comes to us in Britain as the Old Man Time or as a Jack Frost figure. So we can see that in Europe we have this archetype of the male god who is olden aspect, but generous and beneficial, and who appears at this time of midwinter. This figure of Dod Moroz is mentioned in the Kalevala of the Finns. So he was probably part of an ancient religious culture. But he also has a female counterpart in Germanic myth, and this is Mother Holla, or Frau Holla as she is called. Now, Holla and Yoli and Yol and Yule all seem to have a kind of similar roots. Holla comes from a Proto-Germanic word which actually means kind, generous and beneficent. Yol, although it means whole, the wheel, the turning, actually also means jolly and, amusement and fun. So there is a sense at this time that the season is here to be celebrated, and the deities of the season are kind and, well, good fun. Now, Frau Holla's festival was held at the 12 nights of Christmas, and these were called the Zwölfen in Germanic lore. And they were considered to be a time out of time. They didn't really belong to one year or another. They were an in-between place. And at this time of year, Grandmother Holla, or Frau Holla, would go around visiting people, and she would give gifts to those who had worked hard and who were good and kind. And she could curse those who were lazy, who had been bad. Now, as patriarchal religion came in, I think the figure of Frau Holla became much maligned. And it was told about her that she did not want to go to heaven, but in fact she wanted to remain on earth and hunt. And so as punishment for this, her children were turned into wild hunting dogs, and they roamed the night and they roamed the winter. And they pull a sled or a carriage which takes Frau Holla around the land, and as she visits house to house she just judges whether people have been good or bad and acts accordingly. Now, Maria Gombutas says that Frau Holla is actually a very ancient deity that precedes Indo-European deities. In fact, precedes the Norse pantheon as we know them. So she's a very, very ancient deity indeed, and may have been the main deity of the Germans in ages past. So she interestingly shared a connection with Mother Mary in early Christian theology. They could not really separate the two, so they combined these two forces. And an early 13th century text says how the peasants would set a place at their Christmas Eve meal for what they called the Queen of Heaven, whom they recall as Frau Holder, so that she may aid and help them. Now, this travelling about the skies or travelling about the land on a carriage may make us think of Odin, who was reputed to run about the skies, travel about the skies in the wild hunt at the depths of winter, and these traditions were still recorded in Devon quite late into Christianity. And so we can see some crossover between Odin riding through the skies and Frau Holder riding on sleds or carriages that are drawn by animals, particularly totem animals such as the horse or the dogs, or in our tradition such as reindeer. In Scandinavia it's also traditional that the goat pulls this chariot or sled, and he delivers gifts as well, and the goat is of course the sacred animal of the god Thor. we actually have the tradition of reindeer. Now this was kind of possibly reinvented sometime in the last century, but I do actually believe in ancestral memory and ancestral creativity, in that mythic themes will come up and find a way into popular consciousness again. But this relation to reindeer pulling sleds may actually relate to the Sami. And the Sami were the last people in Europe to continue paganism much later in time than the rest of Europe. So they kept the old ways much longer, and so ancestrally we are referring to that Norse tradition that the Samis retained. And so almost in the figures of Odin and in the figures of Valhalla, I see them as a kind of Mr. and Mrs. Father Christmas, who were the great-grandmothers, as the American Indians would call them, the great-grandfathers, the great-grandmothers. This is a tradition that perhaps we've lost. But it was true that on Christmas Eve and around Christmas time, the dead were said to be close to our world and walking about, especially as it was a time out of time. It was a magical time in which the worlds were blended. And so on Christmas Eve there was a certain amount of reverence for those who had passed on and for those ancestors that were close by. So King Håkon of Norway was the first to change the date of the Yule feast from whenever it was held, which was probably sometime around mid-January, to the 25th of December, and this happened when he decided that Norway was going to convert to Christianity. And so he kind of combined the two faiths in order to make the transition smoother. Now we have some recordings of what the traditional Yule time was like, and these are references in sagas where we're told that a horse was sacrificed and it was a sacred animal, and that horse meat was eaten, and also that the horse's blood was dipped in a bowl, put in a bowl and dipped with twigs of ash, which they called aspergills, and then it was sprinkled around the idols in the temple and also around the temple itself. And in the centre of the temple was built a great fire where they would make toasts and make vows. Now they would take their vows on the body of a sacred sacrificed boar, and as this was so sacred tradition, if you had sworn on the sacrificial boar, then you were held to that, and to dishonour your oath would mean death. Of course, this is where we get our tradition of making New Year's resolutions from, although we don't quite see it in the same sacred light. Now, the fire that was built in the centre of the temple around which they would make toasts reminds me very much of the tradition that maintained into the 20th century of the Yule Log. And toasts would be made around this fire, and ale would be drunk. And the first toast would be to Odin, and it would ask for victory. The second toast would be made to Njord and Freyr, and this would ask for peace and prosperity and fertility. The third toast would be made to the king himself, and then further toasts would be made to the memory of long lost loved ones. So I would like to take this sacred fire that was built in the centre of the temple and relate it to the tradition of the Yule log. So the traditions that come down to us are the bringing in of evergreen boughs into a house, the bringing in of a tree which is lit by bright lights, and until the last century we maintained a tradition of burning a Yule log. Now, the Yule log was a large tree or a large branch that was supposedly burnt for 12 nights. And in days gone past, this was a huge log that was slowly fed into the fire over the whole season of Christmas. Now these days this is just not practical. But what can we learn about the Yule log, and how can we use a Yule log in pagan tradition these days? Well, once it was traditional to go out and hunt and gather a Yule log specifically to be brought into the home, and people would go into the woodlands and find a good log to use, which they would treat with certain ceremony. So this could be a tradition of the family going out and dragging a Yule log home, or in some cases it was the tradition for the father to go out and bring back a Yule log for the family. The Yule log in many ways is symbolic of the great tree of Yggdrasil. So it was burnt for 12 nights, and what was left of the log was brought into the home or left in the home. And various traditions tell how it was either left under the beds, and this was to bring good luck into the home. Alternatively, it was to avert fire and lightning from the home. Sometimes it was kept for the following year, where it would kindle next year's Yule fire. But more commonly, the ashes were taken out and sprinkled over the soil to bring fertility to the land and to the crops for the following year. And tradition says that this often took place on New Year's Eve. It seems that the original tradition of the Christmas tree may have actually taken place outside, and candles were set upon the tree to actually set it alight. And in a similar fashion, once the tree had burnt out, the ashes were taken and sprinkled on the soil to bring fertility to the land. That this kindling of a fire upon a tree would be very symbolic to me of the world tree of Yggdrasil. Now, Yggdrasil has been described variously as an ash tree or possibly as a yew tree. In one of the sagas it is described as an evergreen tree, and this led one scholar to describe the mistranslation of the word, which originally should actually have meant yew, as in Yggdrasil. Now, it has been called both an ash and a yew, and it's possible that it did actually identify with both of these trees. Now, what we know is that in many Yorkshire counties and in Lincolnshire and the southwest, where the remains of the Anglo-Saxon customs were retained, that well into the 20th century there was a tradition of going out and gathering the ashen faggots. Now, the ashen faggot was a bundle of ash twigs tied together with withes of willow or bramble, and this was set light on the fire on Christmas Eve. And according to sources, Christmas Eve was considered a vigil. They would stay awake all night, and this was because the dead were walking abroad. So it was kind of considered a vigil for the dead, and they would stay awake by the light of this ashen faggot fire, and every time the fire burst into sparks, each layer flaring up, a great cheer would go up, and they would toast to their friends and to their families and to their long lost loved ones, and drink copious amounts of cider. And the night passed in this manner. Now, after they had burnt the ashen faggot, the next morning the first thing to be brought into a house would be an evergreen leaf. And this would symbolically be the burning away of the old year and the bringing in of a new fertile year and new growth. Now, in many ways, the ashen faggot was also sprinkled on the soil, but it was unlucky to take it out of the house on Christmas Day. So it must be left in home on Christmas Day and then only removed from the house after that. And then again it was sprinkled on the soil on New Year's Eve. So these traditions have come down to us, and we don't all have a fire, but possibly we could make use of this Yule Log tradition in our own ways. It would seem to symbolise commemoration of the dead and of the and of death itself, and we could take some time, if we are going to burn a Yule log in whatever symbolic fashion, to think about what has passed in our dying year and whatever processes we have been through, and then bring in new plans and new life and new hope with an evergreen leaf on Christmas morning. Now, in some parts of France, the Yule log was covered with a coating of red wine, and the explanation for this was that it would make the Yule log smell nicer as it burnt on the fire. But of course, originally in ancient days it would have been covered with the blood of a sacrificed animal. So we can adopt this and we can adapt this, and this is what I've done with my own Yule log. I actually poured mulled wine over the log, and now it's sitting and drying, and I will burn it on Christmas Eve. And this is to offer a sacrifice and to honour this log, to make it slightly more sacred. Now, if you don't have a log, you could perhaps burn a candle overnight or in the hours of Christmas Eve, and then put it out safely, of course. Or you could set a candle by what we traditionally use these days is a chocolate cake. And we call this the Yule Log, but it actually stems from the French tradition of the Bûche de Noël, where it is feasted upon is the symbolic feasting of this tree that is the source of all life. So we can adapt and we can change, but it's wise to remember some kind of magical ceremony that we can add to our traditions. And it's true that Christianity has tried to stamp out the tradition of Yule several times, but it always comes back to us, and it is actually a tradition that is hundreds, if not thousands of years old. So it would seem to be one of our most loved seasonal celebrations, and something that it's very important to mark, especially in Northern Europe, when we are so dependent on that returning sun to bring us out of darkness and to bring us out of the cold. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this little talk on Yule traditions and the Yule log, and I hope it's given you something to think about. If you did enjoy it, then please like and subscribe. Thank you for listening. Thank you to my new subscribers, and have a merry Yule. Thank you. Bye.